The night shift on Station Westwind was always quiet, and Kira preferred it that way because the silence let her think while she monitored the long-range sensors, and her two dragons, Ash and Ember, slept curled around the base of her chair. She had been a dragon rider for 12 years now, and the work had become routine in the way that dangerous things become normal when you do them long enough. And tonight seemed like it would be another boring shift until the console started beeping. Kira sat forward immediately, and her pointed ears twitched as she recognized the pattern as a distress signal. And not just any signal, but one coded for extreme emergency, and the kind that meant someone was about to die. Her fingers moved quickly across the controls and brought up the message, and she felt Ash lift his scarred head beside her as if sensing her sudden tension, and Ember opened one golden eye to watch her rider with concern. The signal was coming from far beyond silvery space and from a region that her people had never explored, and the coordinates placed it nearly 4 days' travel away at maximum speed, and that alone made her hesitate. But then the message finished decoding, and Kira felt her blood turn cold as she read the words scrolling across her screen and saw the desperate plea for help from a species she had never heard of before. They called themselves humans, and they were colonists on a world named Nova Terra, and the Zarkoth Hive had found them 3 weeks ago, and now they were dying and begging anyone who could hear them for rescue. Kira knew about the Zarkoth because every intelligent species in the galaxy knew about them and feared them, and they were an insect race that moved through space like locusts and consumed everything in their path. The Zarkoth did not negotiate or show mercy, and they existed only to feed and reproduce and spread, and dozens of civilizations had fallen before their swarms over the centuries, and no military force had ever successfully stopped a full hive assault. Her own people, the Silvery, had lost 3 colony worlds to the Zarkoth in the last 100 years, and each time they had chosen to evacuate and abandon their settlements rather than face the swarm because fighting was suicide. The Dragon Riders were among the most elite warriors in Silvery culture, and they bonded with their dragons from hatching and trained for decades, but even they knew that some enemies could not be defeated through courage alone. Kira read through the human message again and felt her hands trembling as she saw the numbers they had listed, and the colonists had started with 12,000 people, but now only 800 remained alive. They had been fighting for 3 weeks without any support or reinforcements, and their ammunition was nearly gone and their defenses were crumbling. And the message estimated they had maybe 5 more days before the Zarkoth overran their final positions. The humans were asking for military support or evacuation ships or even just basic supplies and medical aid, and anything that might help them survive a little longer. And the desperation in every line of text made Kira's chest ache. She had read messages like this before when her people had sent similar pleas from their doomed colonies, and she remembered the feeling of helplessness when no rescue had come, because everyone knew the Zarkoth could not be stopped. For a long moment, Kira just sat there staring at the screen while her mind raced through possibilities, and she knew that protocol required her to forward this to the Council and let them decide what to do. The Council would debate for days and eventually decide that an unknown species in uncharted space was not their responsibility, and that the Silvari could not risk their warriors on a rescue mission that would probably fail anyway. They would send their regrets to the humans and wish them well, and then file the message away and forget about it because that was the practical thing to do and the smart thing and the safe thing. But something about this message was different, and Kira could not explain why, but she felt it deep in her bones. And maybe it was the way the humans had kept fighting for 3 weeks against impossible odds. Maybe it was the fact that they were still asking for help instead of just accepting death, and she had seen what happened to people when they gave up hope. And these humans clearly had not done that yet. Kira made a decision that she knew might end her career or even her life, and she opened a new channel and began composing a response to the human distress signal before she could change her mind. Her message was simple and direct, and she told them that she was Kira of the Silvery Dragon Riders, and that help was coming, and that they needed to hold their position for 3 more days, and she would reach them with reinforcements. She sent the message before she could reconsider, and then sat back in her chair and took a deep breath and realized that Ash and Ember were both awake now, and watching her with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand something important had happened. Now came the hard part, because she needed to convince her commander to approve this mission, and High Rider Lenara was a practical woman who had survived 30 years of service by not taking foolish risks. Kira saved the human message to a data crystal, and then stood up and stretched her wings slightly and felt the familiar ache in her shoulders from sitting too long, and her dragons rose with her and followed as she left the monitoring station. High Rider Lenara lived in quarters near the command center, and Kira knew she would be awake because the woman barely slept and spent most nights reviewing reports and planning training exercises for the younger riders. She knocked on the door and waited, and heard movement inside before Lenara opened it and looked at her with raised eyebrows and asked what was so urgent that it could not wait until morning. Kira held up the data crystal and said she had received a distress signal from an unknown species under attack by the Zarkoth, and that she had already promised them help, and Lenara's expression went from curious to angry in seconds. The High Rider invited her inside with a gesture that was more command than invitation, and Kira entered the small quarters and watched as Lenara loaded the data crystal and read through the human message with a deepening frown. When she finished reading, Lenara turned to face her and asked in a quiet, dangerous voice if Kira understood what she had done by promising aid without authorization and by committing Silvari resources to a rescue mission in uncharted space. Kira met her commander's eyes and said yes. She understood perfectly, and that she would take full responsibility for her actions and face whatever consequences the council deemed appropriate. But she was not going to let these humans die alone. Lenara stared at her for a long moment, and something flickered in the older woman's eyes, and she asked why Kira cared so much about strangers from a species they had never met before. Kira thought about that question and realized she did not have a good answer, except that the humans had been fighting for 3 weeks when any sensible species would have surrendered or fled, and that meant something. She told Lenara that maybe they could learn something from studying how humans fought the Zarkoth, and that the intelligence alone would be worth a 3-day journey. And it was a thin excuse, but it was better than admitting she was acting on emotion. Lenara looked at her for another long moment, and then sighed deeply, and said that Kira could take her wing of 6 dragon riders. But this mission was completely unofficial, and if they died out there, the council would deny any knowledge. Kira felt relief wash over her, and she thanked her commander and turned to leave. But Lenara stopped her with a hand on her shoulder and said quietly that she hoped these humans were worth dying for. Within an hour, Kira had gathered her team, and they were all veterans who had fought the Zarkoth before and knew exactly what they were flying toward, and not one of them hesitated when she explained the situation. There was Petra, who flew the Silver Dragon Frost and had lost her sister to a Zarkoth attack 10 years ago. And there was Ming with her green dragon Vine, who was the best scout in the wing. There was Zara and her black dragon Shadow, who specialized in night attacks, and there was Isla with the blue dragon Storm, who could fly faster than anyone else. And there was Nicole with her red dragon Blaze, who was the youngest but fearless. They loaded their dragons with supplies and weapons and checked their equipment 3 times because they all knew this might be a one-way trip, and then they launched from Station Westwind and jumped to hyperspace. The journey would take 3 days, and Kira spent that time monitoring the increasingly desperate updates from Nova Terra and watching the human defensive perimeter shrink hour by hour on her tactical display. She wondered what kind of people these humans were, and whether they would still be alive when her team arrived, and whether 6 dragon riders would make any difference at all against a Zarkoth hive. But she had made her choice and sent her promise, and now all she could do was fly as fast as possible and hope they would not arrive too late. The drop out of hyperspace was rough, and Kira felt her stomach lurch as reality snapped back into focus around her dragon, and the first thing she saw through the viewport made her breath catch in her throat. Nova Terra hung in space ahead of them, looking like a wounded animal, and the planet was beautiful with blue oceans and green continents, but half of the main landmass was covered in something that looked like black mold spreading across the surface. That was the Zarkoth hive, and Kira had seen it before on other worlds, and she knew that beneath that dark carpet were billions of insects working and breeding and consuming everything organic they could find. The orbital space around the planet was filled with debris, and she could See the broken hulls of human ships drifting among the wreckage, and some of them were still burning and casting flickering light across the darkness. Scattered among the human wrecks were the organic shapes of Zarkoth bioships, and they looked like enormous beetles with their carapace hulls reflecting starlight, and they moved in slow orbits waiting to land more troops on the planet below. Kira opened her comm channel and called to her wing and heard their responses as they all dropped out of hyperspace around her, and she could hear the shock in their voices as they took in the scene. Petra was the first to speak, and she said quietly that this was worse than any previous Zarkoth attack she had seen, and that the humans must have fought incredibly hard to survive even this long. Ming pointed out that the bioships were concentrated on the far side of the planet, which meant the human settlement must be on the near side, and that gave them a narrow window to reach the surface. Before being detected, Kira checked her tactical display and found the source of the distress signal, and it was a small cluster of lights on the northern continent surrounded by the spreading darkness of the hive, and she marked the coordinates for her team. They began their descent toward the planet and flew their dragons through the debris field and past the drifting wrecks, and Kira tried not to think about how many humans had died in those ships trying to defend their home. As they entered the atmosphere, she could see the scale of the devastation more clearly, and entire cities were nothing but burned-out ruins, and forests had been stripped to bare ground, and rivers ran dark with pollution from Zarkoth feeding. The hive itself was a nightmare to look at, and it pulsed and writhed like something alive because it was alive, and millions of Zarkoth moved across its surface in patterns that looked random, but were actually terrifyingly organized. They flew over the edge of the hive, and Kira saw the front lines where human defenses had been overrun, and there were trenches and bunkers and fortifications, but all of them had been swarmed and consumed. The Zarkoth were particularly good at overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers, and they would sacrifice thousands of drones without hesitation to breach a wall or collapse a bunker, and no amount of courage could stand against that forever. But as they flew closer to the human settlement, Kira began to see signs that this colony had not gone down easily, and the ground was littered with Zarkoth corpses, and some areas showed evidence of coordinated fire that had cut down entire waves. There were burn marks from explosives, and areas where the ground had been deliberately collapsed to create barriers and defensive positions that had been designed by someone who understood military tactics. The human settlement finally came into view, and it was much smaller than Kira had expected, and just a cluster of buildings surrounded by makeshift walls, and she could see people moving on those walls and wondered how many were left. She opened a channel on the frequency from the distress signal and identified herself and asked to speak with whoever was in command. And there was a moment of silence before a woman's voice came through. The woman said her name was Claire Harper, and she was the colony administrator and military commander, and she sounded exhausted but alert, and there was something in her voice that suggested she had not slept in days. Claire asked if they were really the Sylvari dragon riders and if they had actually come to help, and Kira could hear the disbelief in her voice as if she had stopped expecting anyone to answer their calls. Kira confirmed. They were here to help and asked for permission to land outside the walls, and Claire gave them coordinates and warned them to come in from the north, because the south and east approaches were heavily infested. They descended toward the settlement, and Kira got her first close look at the human defenses, and she was impressed despite herself, because these people had built their walls from whatever they could find, including wrecked vehicles and shipping containers. The walls were lined with fighting positions, and she could see humans moving along them with weapons ready, and they looked tired and dirty, and many of them were wounded, but none of them looked defeated. Kira guided Ash down to land in a cleared area just outside the main gate, and her team followed, and their dragons settled onto the ground with their wings folded, and their eyes watching the perimeter with alert attention. The gate opened, and a group of humans emerged, and Kira dismounted from Ash and walked forward to meet them, and she got her first good look at the species she had traveled 3 days to help. Humans were shorter than Sylvari, and they had round ears and no wings, and their skin came in different shades, and they looked soft and fragile compared to her people who had evolved as warriors. But then she looked at their eyes and saw something that made her reconsider that first impression. And these humans had the eyes of people who had been fighting for their lives and refused to quit. Claire Harper was easy to identify because she walked at the front of the group, and she was a woman of medium height with brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and dirt smudged across her face. She wore combat armor that was scorched and dented, and carried a rifle that looked well used, and when she reached Kira, she held out her hand in what must be a human greeting gesture. Kira took her hand and was surprised by the strength of Claire's grip, and the human woman smiled and said she had honestly thought no one would come and that seeing the Dragon's Land had been the most beautiful sight of her life. Kira introduced her team and Claire introduced the people with her, and there was Betty Chen, who was the chief medical officer, and Antonio Lopez, who commanded what remained of the security forces. There was also Diane Foster, who managed supplies and logistics, and Gregory Blake, who was an engineer and had designed most of their defensive improvements, and a young woman named Sofia Martinez, who served as Claire's second-in-command. Claire suggested they move inside the walls to talk, and Kira agreed, and they walked through the gate into the settlement, and what she saw there made her heart sink. The buildings were damaged, and some had collapsed, and there were wounded people lying on stretchers in every available space, and the smell of smoke and blood and exhaustion hung over everything. Children watched from doorways with wide, frightened eyes, and elderly people helped where they could, and everyone looked like they were running on nothing but determination, and the knowledge that giving up meant death. Claire led them to what had been the colony administration building, and was now serving as command center and hospital and armory all at once, and she gestured for Kira to sit at a table covered with maps. The maps showed the colony and the surrounding area, and the Zarkoth positions were marked in red, and Kira could see they had the settlement surrounded on 3 sides and were slowly closing the noose. Claire explained their situation with brutal honesty and said they had 642 people left, including children and elderly, and of those only 43 were combat capable, and the rest were wounded or too young or too old. They had ammunition for maybe 2 more days of heavy fighting, and after that they would be down to melee weapons and improvised explosives, and their water supply was contaminated, and food was running low. The Zarkoth had pulled back yesterday to regroup, but scouts reported they were massing for another major assault, and Claire estimated it would come sometime in the next 12 to 18 hours. Kira listened to all of this and did the math in her head and realized that, even with her dragon riders, they did not have enough force to hold against a full Zarkoth assault, and evacuation was the only logical option. She said as much to Claire and explained that her dragons could carry maybe 15 people each if they pushed the weight limits, and that meant they could evacuate 90 people in the first trip. They could make multiple trips and save most of the colony if they started immediately, and Claire listened to this proposal and then looked at Kira with an expression that was both grateful and sad. She thanked Kira for coming and for offering evacuation, but said she needed to discuss it with her people first, and that they had already voted once on whether to abandon the colony, and the answer had been no. Kira felt confusion wash over her and asked why anyone would choose to stay and fight when evacuation was possible, and Claire smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. She said that Nova Terra was their home, and they had built it with their own hands and buried their dead in this soil, and some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were impossible. Kira stared at her and remembered the 3 Sylvari colonies that had been abandoned to the Zarkoth and how her people had justified retreat as wisdom and practicality. The colonists gathered in the central square, and it was not really a square anymore because half the buildings around it were damaged or collapsed, but people came anyway, and they brought their wounded and their children. Kira stood beside Claire on a makeshift platform and watched as 600 people assembled, and she had never seen such a ragged group, and they were dirty and exhausted, and many were bandaged, but their eyes were alert. Her dragon riders spread out around the edges of the crowd with their dragons, and she noticed how the human children stared at the great beasts with wonder, despite their fear, and some of the braver ones edged closer. Claire raised her hands for silence, and the crowd quieted immediately, and she explained that the Sylvari had come in response to their distress call, and that Commander Kira had offered to evacuate as many people as possible. She laid out the numbers clearly and said the dragons could carry 90 people per trip, and with multiple trips they could save most of the colony before the next Zarkoth assault, but it would mean abandoning Nova Terra forever. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then people started talking among themselves, and Kira heard arguments breaking out and saw families huddled together discussing their options. An older man raised his hand and Claire recognized him, and he asked where they would go if they evacuated, and what would happen to their homes and everything they had built. Kira stepped forward to answer and explained that her people could take them to Station Westwind temporarily, and from there they could contact human authorities and arrange transport back to Earth or to another colony. A woman holding a small child asked if they would lose everything, and Kira had to be honest and said yes because the Zarkoth would consume the colony completely and nothing would remain. Another man asked how they could choose who would go first and who would stay behind to wait for the second trip, and Kira heard the unspoken question, which was, what happens if the Zarkoth attack before everyone is evacuated? Claire answered that one and said they would prioritize children and wounded first, and then elderly, and then anyone else, and that she and the remaining security forces would hold the walls until the last trip. A young woman near the front spoke up, and her voice carried across the square, and she said her name was Rachel Ortiz, and she wanted to know if running away was really what they wanted to do. The crowd went silent again, and Rachel continued speaking and said they had already voted once to stay and fight, and that was before they knew help was coming, and now they had 6 dragon riders and their situation was better, not worse. She pointed out that Nova Terra was their home and they had spent 5 years building it, and that her husband and daughter were buried here, and she was not ready to abandon them. An older woman stood up and said her name was Linda Wright, and she agreed with Rachel and said she was too old to start over somewhere else and would rather die defending her home than live as a refugee. Antonio Lopez, the security commander, stood and said he understood the desire to stay but wanted everyone to be realistic about their chances, and even with the dragon riders they were facing impossible odds. He explained that the Zarkoth had them outnumbered thousands to 1, and that they were low on ammunition and supplies, and that staying meant certain death for many of them. But then Gregory Blake, the engineer, stood and said that certain death was different from guaranteed death, and that the dragons changed the tactical situation and gave them options they did not have before. He suggested they could use the dragons for hit-and-run attacks on Zarkoth staging areas, and that air superiority would let them strike at the hive's weak points and maybe delay the next assault long enough for something to change. Kira listened to this debate with growing amazement, because these humans were actually discussing whether to stay and fight against an enemy that had destroyed civilizations, and her people would never have this conversation. The Silvari would calculate the odds and choose retreat without hesitation, because survival was paramount and living to fight another day was considered wisdom, not cowardice. But these humans seemed to operate on different logic, and they weighed their lives against intangible things like home and dignity and the memory of their dead, and they were not automatically choosing the safe option. A man holding a small boy asked what would happen to the children if they stayed and fought, and that question silenced the crowd, because everyone knew the answer. Claire said quietly that if they chose to stay, the children would have the same chance as everyone else, and that she would not lie and say they would definitely survive. Betty Chen, the medical officer, stood and said she had been treating wounded for 3 weeks and had watched good people die, and she understood wanting to fight, but they needed to think about the children first. She argued that the adults could make their own choices, but the children deserved a chance at life, and that evacuating them at least would be the right thing. Even if the adults stayed, Rachel Ortiz shook her head and said splitting families was not acceptable, and that if the children left, the parents would be distracted, worrying about them, and would fight less effectively. The debate continued for another 20 minutes, and Kira watched the humans argue with passion and intelligence, and she saw how they listened to each other and considered different viewpoints. Finally, Claire called for a vote and said they would use the same method as before, and anyone who wanted to evacuate should raise their hand, and anyone who wanted to stay and fight should keep their hands down. The crowd went silent, and people looked at each other and at their families, and Kira saw the weight of the decision on every face. Hands started going up, and Kira counted them, and saw maybe 50 people voting to evacuate, and most of them were parents with very young children or elderly, people who looked too frail to fight. But the vast majority kept their hands down, and Kira felt her breath catch as she realized what she was seeing. And these humans had just voted to stay and fight despite knowing they would probably die. Claire nodded slowly and said the vote was clear, and they would stay and defend Nova Terra. And she thanked those who wanted to evacuate, and said they would arrange transport for them immediately. Then she turned to Kira, and said she understood if the Silvari wanted to take the evacuees and leave because they had fulfilled their promise by offering help, and no one would blame them for not wanting to die in someone else's fight. Kira looked at Claire and then at the crowd of humans who had just chosen almost certain death over abandoning their home, and she felt something shift in her chest. She thought about the 3 silvery colonies that had been evacuated, and how her people had justified retreat, and she thought about what her commander had said about hoping these humans were worth dying for. Then she turned to her team and saw Petra and Ming and Zara and Isla and Nicole all watching her and waiting for her decision, and she saw in their eyes that they were thinking the same thing. Kira turned back to Claire and said that the silvery dragon riders would not be leaving, and that if the humans were willing to fight for their home, then her team would fight beside them. The crowd erupted in cheers and people were crying and hugging each other, and Kira felt hands reaching out to touch her arms and shoulders, and heard voices thanking her in words that came from deep gratitude. Claire gripped her hand hard and said something in a quiet voice that Kira barely heard over the noise, but it sounded like "Thank you for showing us we are not alone." The celebration lasted only a few minutes before Claire called everyone back to order and said they had work to do, and limited time, and needed to prepare for the coming assault. She organized the colonists into groups and sent people to reinforce defenses and check weapons and prepare medical stations and coordinate supply distribution, and everyone moved with purpose. Kira gathered her dragon riders and they discussed tactics, and Gregory Blake joined them with maps and suggestions about where dragon strikes would be most effective against Zarkoth formations. They planned coordinated attacks using the dragon's fire breath to create barriers and kill zones, and discussed how to maximize their limited ammunition by having the dragons draw Zarkoth into concentrated areas. As the sun began to set, Kira walked the walls with Antonio Lopez, and he pointed out their defensive positions and explained their back plan if the walls were breached. He showed her where they had set up overlapping fields of fire and where they had rigged explosives to collapse sections of wall onto attacking Zarkoth, and where they had prepared final defensive positions around the most vulnerable buildings. Kira was impressed by the thought that had gone into these defenses, and she told Antonio that his people fought like warriors, and he smiled grimly and said they fought like humans, which meant they were too stubborn to know when they were beaten. As night fell, the colonists shared a meal, and someone had found alcohol somewhere, and people were passing bottles around and telling stories and laughing, despite everything. Kira sat with Claire and Betty and some others and listened as the humans talked about the early days of the colony and the challenges they had overcome, and the dreams they had for what Nova Terra could become. She realized these people had invested 5 years of their lives into this place, and that every building and road and field represented someone's effort and hope, and that was why they could not just walk away. The attack came 3 hours before dawn, when the darkness was deepest and most people were trying to rest, and the first warning was the sound of millions of legs moving across the ground. Kira was on the south wall when she heard it, and the sound made her scales crawl because she had heard it before and knew what it meant, and she grabbed the alarm bell and rang it hard. The colony came alive instantly, and people poured from buildings half-dressed and grabbed weapons and ran to their assigned positions, and within 2 minutes every section of wall was manned. Claire appeared beside Kira, pulling on her armor and asking for a status report, and Kira pointed into the darkness where the sound was growing louder. Then the first Zarkoth emerged from the shadows, and it was a scout drone about the size of a large dog with razor mandibles and too many legs, and it chittered as it approached the wall. Antonio Lopez shot it from 30 meters away, and the creature exploded in a spray of green ichor, but behind it came more, and then suddenly the entire southern approach was covered in moving bodies. The colonists opened fire, and the sound was deafening, and muzzle flashes lit up the darkness, and Zarkoth started dying in waves. But there were always more behind them. Kira whistled for Ash, and the dragon launched himself into the air, and she felt the familiar rush of flight as they climbed above the walls, and she could see the full scope of the attack. The Zarkoth were coming from 3 directions and leaving only the north approach clear, and there were thousands of them forming a living carpet that flowed toward the colony like a dark tide. She opened her comm and told her team to engage, and all 6 dragons took flight and began their attack runs, and the night lit up with fire as they breathed flames across the Zarkoth formations. The insects burned well, and their screams were horrible, but they did not break or retreat, and they just kept coming and stepped over the bodies of their dead without hesitation. Petra and Frost hit the eastern approach and created a wall of fire that temporarily halted the advance, and Ming and Vine targeted what looked like a command cluster and scattered the Zarkoth coordination Zara, and Shadow came in low from the west and raked the Zarkoth lines with claws before climbing away, and Isla and Storm made high-speed passes that disrupted the enemy formations. Nicole and Blaze worked with Kira to protect the southern wall where the main assault was focused, and they took turns diving and burning and climbing and diving again until their dragons were exhausted. But no matter how many Zarkoth they killed, more kept coming, and Kira realized with cold certainty that this was exactly what the insects wanted, and they were using drones to exhaust the defenders before the real assault began. She told Claire this over the comm, and the human commander cursed and ordered everyone to conserve ammunition and only fire when targets were close and to let the dragons handle the distant threats. The battle continued for 2 hours, and the sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, and that was when the Zarkoth changed tactics and sent in their warrior forms. These were bigger than the drones and stood nearly 2 meters tall, and had armored carapaces that could deflect small arms fire, and mandibles that could bite through metal. They hit the south wall in a coordinated rush and overwhelmed a section of defenders, and breached the outer barrier, and suddenly Zarkoth were inside the colony perimeter. Antonio led a counterattack with 20 fighters, and they pushed the insects back with concentrated fire. But 3 humans died in the first 30 seconds, and 5 more were wounded. Kira brought Ash down inside the walls and used his fire to create a barrier that sealed the breach and gave the humans time to reinforce the position with debris and welded metal. The eastern wall came under heavy pressure. Next, and the defenders there were running low on ammunition and starting to use melee weapons, and Petra brought Frost down to support them. Kira saw a human woman named Paula Rodriguez holding a section of wall alone with nothing but a metal pipe, and she was killing Zarkoth with brutal efficiency and buying time for wounded to retreat behind her. She killed 17 insects before reinforcements arrived, and when Kira saw her afterward, she was covered in green ichor and breathing hard, but her eyes were fierce and she just nodded and returned to the line. The battle intensified as the sun rose, and Kira could see the full horror of the Zarkoth assault, and they had brought massive siege forms that were the size of vehicles and had rams on their heads to break walls. The humans targeted these with their few remaining explosives and managed to bring down 3 of them, but 2 others reached the walls and started pounding, and the barrier began to crack. Gregory Blake rigged a desperate trap and collapsed a section of wall onto one of the siege forms and crushed it, but the collapse also created a gap that Zarkoth immediately exploited. The fighting became hand-to-hand in places, and Kira saw humans using knives and improvised weapons and pure determination to hold their positions, and she had never seen anything like their refusal to break. An older man named Henry Kim deliberately drew a swarm of Zarkoth toward himself and led them away from a group of children, and he died buying 30 seconds, but those seconds let the children reach safety. Betty Chen was working in the medical station, and it was overwhelmed with wounded, and she was operating on people with minimal supplies and no pain medication, and somehow keeping them alive through skill and will. A young girl, maybe 12 years old, was running ammunition to the walls, and she made a dozen trips carrying boxes that were nearly too heavy for her, and she never complained or showed fear. Kira found herself fighting beside Claire, and they held a section of wall together, and the human commander fought with a rifle until it was empty, and then with a pistol, and then with a knife. She saw Claire take a hit from a Zarkoth claw that opened a gash across her arm, but the woman just wrapped it quickly and kept fighting and told Kira they needed to hold for 1 more hour. Kira asked why 1 hour mattered, and Claire smiled grimly and said, because that was when the Zarkoth would realize they could not break the human spirit and would have to reassess their strategy. The dragons were exhausted and their fire was weaker, but they kept fighting, and Ash stayed close to Kira and used his bulk to shield humans from Zarkoth attacks. At one point, a warrior Form got past the line and charged toward a building where children were sheltering, and Ember intercepted it and killed it, but took a wound to her wing that left her unable to fly. Nicole stayed with Ember to protect her, and they fought side by side on the ground and held a section of perimeter that should have required 10 defenders. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became oppressive, and everyone was exhausted and running on nothing but adrenaline and determination, and still the Zarkoth kept coming. Kira lost track of how many insects she killed, and her arms ached from swinging her blade, and Ash was so tired he could barely breathe fire. But they did not stop. Then something changed, and Kira felt it before she saw it, and the Zarkoth began to pull back, and their assault weakened, and within minutes they were retreating. The defenders were too tired to cheer, and they just collapsed where they stood and tried to catch their breath and assess their wounds, and several people were crying from relief and exhaustion. Claire staggered over to Kira and asked how many they had lost, and Kira did not know, but she could see bodies scattered across the compound and knew the price had been high. Antonio appeared with a count and said they had lost 18 people dead and another 30 seriously wounded, and ammunition was nearly gone, and they could not survive another assault like that. Claire nodded and told everyone they had held, and that was what mattered, and she ordered people to rest and eat and tend to wounds while they had time. Kira walked through the colony and saw the damage, and it was extensive, and whole sections of wall were collapsed, and buildings were burning, and the smell of death hung over everything, but she also saw humans helping each other and sharing food and water and tending to the wounded with gentle hands, and she saw them comfort children and reassure the elderly. She found Rachel Ortiz sitting against a wall, holding her rifle and staring at nothing, and when Kira sat beside her, Rachel said quietly that she was glad they had stayed. Kira asked why, and Rachel said because at least they had fought, and at least they had shown the Zarkoth that humans did not give up easily, and that meant something. Even if they lost Linda Wright, the old woman who had voted to stay was helping in the medical station, despite being wounded herself, and when someone tried to make her rest, she just laughed and said she would rest when she was dead. Sophia Martinez found Kira and said the scouts reported the Zarkoth were regrouping about 2 kilometers away and estimated they would attack again before nightfall. Kira thanked her and then asked how Sophia stayed so calm, and the young woman shrugged and said fear was useless and action was everything, and she would rather die doing something than live as a coward. As the day wore on, Kira realized something profound, and these humans had taught her what her people had forgotten, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. The Silvari had become so focused on survival that they had lost the ability to fight for things that mattered more than living, and these humans had reminded her what that looked like. She gathered her team and they discussed the situation honestly, and agreed they probably could not survive another major assault, but none of them suggested leaving. The second assault came at dusk, and it was even more ferocious than the first, and the Zarkoth had learned from their earlier failure and changed their tactics to focus overwhelming force on single points. They hit the weakened south wall with everything they had, and the barrier collapsed within minutes under the weight of siege forms and warrior drones, and suddenly there were insects pouring into the colony. The defenders fell back to secondary positions and fought with desperate intensity, and Kira saw humans making stands in doorways and alleys and buying time with their lives. Antonio Lopez organized a fighting retreat toward the central buildings, and his security forces moved with practiced coordination, despite their exhaustion, and they saved dozens of civilians through disciplined fire and movement. The dragons were grounded now because they were too tired to fly, and instead they fought alongside the humans as massive armored allies, and their claws and teeth were just as deadly as their fire. Ash stayed with Kira, and together they held a narrow passage that led to the medical station, and they killed everything that tried to pass and refused to give ground. Kira lost count of how many Zarkoth she faced, and her sword arm was numb and her armor was cracked, but she kept fighting because the humans beside her were still fighting, and she would not be the first to quit. She saw Petra and Frost making a last stand at the eastern entrance, and they were surrounded, but refused to retreat, and their courage gave others time to evacuate wounded from nearby buildings. Ming and Vine were fighting in the supply depot and protecting the remaining ammunition and food stores, and they held that position against wave after wave because losing those supplies meant certain death for everyone. The battle raged through the night and became a confused nightmare of close combat and screaming, and the smell of blood and fire, and everyone knew they were losing ground. Claire was everywhere at once, and she moved through the fighting with calm authority and directed defenders and encouraged the exhausted and made impossible decisions about which positions to hold and which to abandon. Kira watched her make the choice to evacuate a building full of children even though it meant abandoning a defensive position, and saw the pain on Claire's face as she gave the order. Betty Chen was still working in the medical station and people kept bringing her wounded, and she kept trying to save them even though her supplies were gone and she was using torn clothing for bandages. A young man brought in his sister who had been badly hurt, and Betty looked at the wound and shook her head, and the young man understood and just held his sister while she died. Kira felt rage building in her chest at the waste and futility, and she wanted to scream at the universe for allowing this, but there was no time for anger, only for fighting. Then something impossible happened, and Kira was fighting near the command center when Sofia Martinez came running and shouting something about contacts in orbit. Claire grabbed a radio and spoke to someone, and her face transformed from exhausted desperation to shocked hope, and she turned to Kira with tears running down her dirty face. She said help was coming, and that a human fleet had dropped out of hyperspace and was engaging the Zarkoth bioships, and that ground forces would be landing within the hour. Kira could not believe it and asked how that was possible, and Claire explained that the distress signal had finally reached Earth, and the military had dispatched an emergency response fleet. The word spread through the defenders like wildfire, and suddenly people were fighting with renewed energy, and the colonists who had been ready to die were now determined to survive. But an hour was a long time, and the Zarkoth were still pressing hard, and the defenders had to hold just a little longer, and that became the mantra that everyone repeated. Hold just a little longer and help is coming and we can do this, and Kira heard humans encouraging each other with those words and saw them find strength they should not have had. The Zarkoth seemed to sense something had changed, and their assault became even more frantic and desperate, as if they knew their window was closing. A massive warrior form broke through the inner perimeter and charged toward a group of children, and Paula Rodriguez threw herself in its path and died buying seconds, but those seconds let others kill the creature. Kira saw the moment when the first human dropship appeared in the sky, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever witnessed, and the colonists cheered even as they continued fighting. More ships followed, and they began landing around the colony perimeter, and armored soldiers poured out, and they were fresh and well-equipped, and they hit the Zarkoth from behind. The tide of battle turned instantly, and the insects found themselves caught between the desperate defenders and the arriving military forces, and they began to break and retreat. Within 20 minutes, the Zarkoth were in full withdrawal and pulling back toward their hive, and the human soldiers pursued them and began setting up a defensive perimeter around the colony. The fighting finally stopped and silence fell over Nova Terra, and it was the strangest sound after hours of constant noise and screaming and weapons fire. People just stood where they were for a moment, not quite believing it was over, and then someone started crying, and then someone else, and then everyone was crying or laughing or both. Kira found herself sitting on the ground with no memory of how she got there, and Ash was beside her breathing hard, and she leaned against his warm scales and felt exhaustion crash over her. Claire sat down next to her, and they did not speak for a long time, and just watched the human soldiers moving through the colony and setting up medical stations and distributing supplies. Finally, Claire said thank you, and Kira asked what for, and Claire said for coming when no one else would, and for staying when leaving would have been smarter. Kira told her that the humans had taught her something important, and that courage was not about being fearless, but about choosing to fight for what mattered, even when you were terrified. The casualty count came in over the next hours, and it was brutal, and they had lost 43 people, dead and another 60 seriously wounded, and the colony was devastated. But 550 people had survived because they refused to quit, and because they stood their ground and fought, and because help had come in time. The human military commander was a woman named Colonel Janet Price, and she told Claire that the fleet had traveled at maximum speed for 3 days after receiving the distress signal. She said the government had dispatched every available ship because they did not abandon their people, and that Nova Terra would be rebuilt and reinforced and would never face the Zarkoth alone again. Over the next days, the military established a permanent garrison and began hunting the Zarkoth hive, and the colonists started the long process of rebuilding and burying their dead. Kira and her team stayed to help, and they flew reconnaissance missions and transported supplies and did whatever was needed, and the humans treated them like heroes. Rachel Ortiz found Kira one morning and thanked her for giving them hope when they needed it most and said the Silvari would always be welcome on Novaterra. Linda Wright survived despite her wounds, and she told Kira that she had lived 72 years, and this had been her finest moment and she regretted nothing. Sofia Martinez was promoted to deputy commander, and she told Kira that what they had accomplished together had proven something important about the power of courage and cooperation between species. When it was time to leave, Claire walked with Kira to where the dragons waited, and they stood together looking at the colony and the construction crews already working to repair the damage. Claire said she hoped this was not goodbye and that the Silvari and humans could maintain contact and learn from each other, and Kira agreed immediately. She said she would return to her people and tell them what had happened and argue that the Silvari needed to remember what humans had shown them about fighting for things that mattered. They embraced, and Kira felt the strength in Claire's arms and remembered how this woman had led her people through impossible odds and never wavered. The flight back to Station Westwind took 3 days, and Kira spent that time thinking about everything that had happened and how it had changed her understanding of courage and sacrifice. When they arrived, High Rider Lenara was waiting, and she listened to Kira's full report without interruption, and then sat back and was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said that what Kira described sounded impossible, and that no species should have been able to hold against those odds, and that humans were clearly remarkable. Kira agreed and said the humans had taught her that sometimes retreat was not wisdom, but simply fear dressed in practical clothing, and that her people had forgotten how to fight for things beyond survival. She argued that the Silvari should establish formal diplomatic relations with humanity and learn from their example, and Lenara said she would bring it before the council. The council debated for 5 days, and Kira attended every session and answered their questions and showed them recordings from Novaterra. And slowly, she saw their attitudes begin to shift. They agreed to establish contact with Earth, and Kira was appointed as the first ambassador, and she brought Ash and Ember with her when she traveled to the human homeworld. Earth amazed her, and it was so full of life and diversity, and everywhere she went, humans greeted her with curiosity and warmth and treated her dragons with respect and wonder.